The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of stirred-up dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the faint, sweet smell of desperation. It was late July, 1978. The sun beat down on the collection of sunburnt necks and sweat-stained hats like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. Men stood in tight knots, kicking tires on equipment that ranged from museum-worthy to nearly new, their voices a low murmur of gossip, crop prices, and mechanical speculation. I was there for one thing, a set of old Oliver moldboard plows, the kind with the trip beam safety release. They were rusting away behind a dilapidated barn, half swallowed by weeds, but I knew the shares and landslides on them were still thick. I could use them to rebuild the ones on my own Oliver 565, which I pulled behind the old Steiger. My plow had hit a granite boulder the size of a small hog last spring, and the number 3 bottom was sprung beyond repair. I didn't need a new plow, I needed good steel. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Hemlock, whose voice could strip paint, was working his way through a wagon of hand tools. I leaned against the fender of a tired-looking Farmall H, content to wait. My place was with the old iron, the forgotten and the worn. It's where I was comfortable. That's when Richard Davies rolled up. He wasn't driving his pickup, he came right up the lane in his brand-new International Harvester 1586, the diesel engine rumbling with a clean, powerful rhythm that was nothing like the guttural roar of my old machines. The cab was enormous, all glass and air conditioning, a space-age control module set down in a field of rusty relics. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was almost as loud as the noise had been. He swung down from the cab, not a speck of dust on his pressed jeans or his new Tony Lama boots. Rich was 10 years my junior and already farmed 3 times the ground I did. He was the golden boy of the county, the one the bankers loved to talk about. He believed in leverage, in expansion, in the gospel of get big or get out, that was being preached from the pages of every farm journal. He saw debt not as a chain, but as a tool. He saw me standing by the Farmall and sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "Jedediah," he said, his voice loud enough for the men nearby to hear. "Didn't figure I'd see you here. I thought you built everything you own from scratch." A few of the men chuckled. I just nodded, not giving him the satisfaction of a rise. "Rich" came for some parts. He followed my gaze to the Oliver plows. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Those things? Hell, Jed, the scrap man wouldn't even haul 'em away for free. The bank's giving away money hand over fist right now. You could have a brand new John Deere V Ripper delivered tomorrow. Why are you wasting your time with this junk?" "This junk is paid for," I said, my voice low and flat, "and so is the tractor that'll pull it." Rich's smirk widened. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant for everyone. "That's your problem, Jed. You think paid for is the finish line. It's the starting line. You're sitting on 250 acres of prime Iowa land, free and clear. Mr. Abernathy down at the bank would give you a $500,000 line of credit on your signature alone. You could trade that old green monster of yours for a new Steiger Panther, get another 500 acres. You're farming like it's 1950. It's almost 1980, old man. You got to use your assets to grow." He called my Steiger Bearcat too, a green monster. It was a 1971 model, one of the first ones with the 3208 Cat engine, not the Cummins. I'd bought it used in '74 from a fellow up in Minnesota who'd gone broke. I paid cash, every last dollar I'd saved. It was an ugly, powerful beast, an articulated 4-wheel drive that could pull a house off its foundation. It didn't have a fancy cab or a radio, just raw, earth-shaking power. And it was mine. No bank had a lien on it. No finance man could come and take it away. To me, that was everything. To Rich, it was a sign of failure, of a lack of ambition. "I'm doing all right, Rich," I said, turning my attention back to the auctioneer. "All right?" he scoffed. "You're a museum curator, Jed, not a farmer. While you're out here hunting for rusty plow parts, I'm signing papers on the Henderson place. Another 320 acres. You can't make money standing still." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt like a branding iron. Then he walked off toward the newer equipment, the crowd parting for him like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea. The men who had been friendly enough to me just minutes before now looked at me with a different expression. It was pity. In their eyes, Rich was right. I was a relic, a stubborn old fool clinging to the past while the future was being built on borrowed money. The auction for the plows came up an hour later. Bill Hemlock looked at the pile of rust and nearly skipped it. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this fine collection of antique steel? Good for a mailbox post, maybe. Who'll give me $10? I raised a finger. 10. Got $10 from Jed Stone. Who'll give me 15? 15? Silence. The men looked at me, then at the plows, and shook their heads. It was junk. Sold, Bill yelled, slamming a fist into his palm, to Jed Stone for $10. As I walked over to pay the clerk, I could feel Rich Davies's eyes on my back. I didn't have to turn around to know he was shaking his head, laughing with his buddies about the old fool buying a $10 pile of rust. I didn't care. I had my steel. I would take it home, cut it up with a torch, weld it, grind it, and make my old plow new again. It would cost me $10 and 2 days of my own labor. Rich's new V-Ripper probably cost him $20,000. Money he didn't have. He hadn't paid for it. The bank had. And the bank always gets its money back. Driving home in my old Ford F-250, the plow parts rattling in the bed, I thought about what Rich had said, about being a museum curator. Maybe he was right. My barn wasn't filled with the latest and greatest. It was filled with machines I knew inside and out. My John Deere 4020, a '68 model with over 10,000 hours on the tack, its diesel engine as reliable as the sunrise. My Massey Ferguson 510 combine, a machine most men had scrapped a decade ago, but I knew every belt, every bearing, every quirk it had. And of course, the Steiger. That magnificent, ugly beast of a tractor that was the heart of my operation. Before we go any further, I have to ask you folks listening. Have you ever known a man like Rich Davies? The kind who measures a man's worth by the color of his tractor and the size of his bank loan. The kind who confuses debt with wealth and motion with progress. Let me know down in the comments, because I suspect this story isn't as uncommon as you'd think. I knew a storm was coming. I didn't know when, but a man can't stand in a field during a long dry spell and not know that the sky will eventually break. And I intended to have my house in order when it did. The next 2 days were spent in my shop. It wasn't a fancy pole barn like the one Rich had just put up. It was an old converted dairy barn with a concrete floor I'd poured myself and a massive I-beam across the top with a chain hoist. The air inside was thick with the smells of old oil, hot metal, and hard work. It was my sanctuary. I backed the Steiger in, its huge dual tires barely clearing the door frame. The Oliver plow was still attached to the 3-point hitch. I lowered it onto a set of heavy-duty sawhorses and got to work. First, I used a 3/4-inch impact wrench, its hammering rattle echoing off the barn walls to break the shear bolts holding the damaged bottom. They were rusted solid. I soaked them in penetrating oil, waited an hour, and tried again. Nothing. The heads of the bolts were starting to round off. This was the kind of problem that would have sent Rich Davies to the dealership. For me, it was just another Tuesday. I fired up my acetylene torch. The hiss of the gas and the sharp crack of the igniter were familiar sounds. I put on my dark goggles and carefully heated the nuts cherry red, the metal glowing like a malevolent eye in the dim light of the barn. A few sharp taps with a 4-pound hammer, and the wrench broke them free with a satisfying groan of tortured steel. With the broken assembly off, I could see the extent of the damage. The main beam was twisted, a long, subtle curve that you could only see if you sighted down it like a rifle barrel. Hitting that rock had done more than just spring the trip beam. I'd have to heat the whole beam and straighten it. I spent the rest of the day cutting the good parts from the auction plows. I used the torch to slice through the thick steel plate, sending showers of orange sparks across the concrete floor. The smell of burnt rust and ozone filled the air. I selected the best landslide and the thickest chair, their cutting edges still showing a decent amount of life. By evening, I had a pile of usable parts and a pile of scrap. The next morning, I started on the twisted beam. This was the hard part. I used the chain hoist to lift the plow frame high enough to work on. then built a fire of hickory logs underneath the bent section. I didn't have a proper forge, but I knew how to make do. As the wood burned down to a bed of glowing coals, I used a fan from an old crop dryer to force air onto them, turning the heat from a simple fire into a roaring furnace. The steel beam began to glow, first a dull red, then a brighter orange. Using a massive pipe wrench with a 6-foot cheetah bar on the handle for leverage, I began to apply pressure, slowly, carefully, working the bend out of the steel. It was hot, brutal work. Sweat poured off me, sizzling on the hot metal. My muscles screamed in protest, but inch by inch the beam came back into true. When I was satisfied, I let the fire die down and allowed the steel to cool slowly so it wouldn't become brittle. While it cooled, I started rebuilding the bottom, bolting the salvaged parts onto my frame. I used new grade 8 plow bolts, torquing them down until my arms ached. I replaced the coulter bearing and sharpened the disc with a grinder. It was tedious, exacting work. Every part had to be perfect, every bolt tight. A failure in the field during planting season could cost me a whole day, a day I couldn't afford to lose. As I was finishing up, Mr. Abernathy, the president of the Farmers' Trust and Savings Bank, pulled into my lane in his shiny Buick Electra. He got out, smoothing his suit jacket, looking entirely out of place next to my muddy pickup. "Jedediah," he said, walking into the barn and wrinkling his nose at the smell. "Working hard, I see." "Always, Mr. Abernathy," I said, wiping my greasy hands on a rag. "Jed, I was just out at the new Davies farm," he said, getting straight to the point. "The old Henderson place. We just financed a new grain leg and 2 50,000 bushel bins for Richard. He's going to have a first-class operation out there." "First class?" I just nodded, waiting. "He mentioned he saw you at the Miller auction," Abernathy continued, his eyes scanning my old equipment. "Said you were buying some parts." He said the word parts like it was something distasteful. "Jed, we need to talk. Commodity prices are the highest they've ever been. Land values are climbing 20% a year. The dollar is weak, which is great for exports. This is the time to expand, my boy, the time to modernize." He pulled a brochure from his inside pocket. On the cover was a picture of a brand new John Deere 8640, the 4-wheel drive articulated model. "We have programs, Jed, low-interest government loans. You have more equity in your land than any man in this county. You're sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a vegetable patch. Let us help you leverage that. Let's get you into a machine like this. Let's buy that quarter section north of you that's coming up for sale." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy," I said, my voice even, "but I'm not looking to take on any new debt." His face fell. It was a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Debt is how you grow, Jed. You can't save your way to prosperity, not with inflation running at 12%. The money you have in the bank is losing value every single day. The smart money is in hard assets, land, iron. Richard Davies understands that. He'll be the biggest operator in this state in 10 years. You'll still be here, welding old plows." He looked at the plow, now nearly reassembled, a Frankenstein's monster of old and new steel. He shook his head in disgust. "You're a good man, Jed. Your father was a good man. But you're stuck in the past. When this boom is over, the men who took the risks are the ones who will own everything. Think about it." He turned and left without another word, climbing back into his air-conditioned Buick and driving away in a cloud of dust. I watched him go, then turned back to my work. I understood his logic. On paper, he and Rich were right. In the world of finance and projections, I was a fool. But my world wasn't made of paper. It was made of steel and soil, of weather and weeds. It was a world where the only thing you could truly count on was what you held in your own 2 hands. I finished torquing the last bolt on the plow, lowered it to the ground, and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. It was strong, it was mine, and it was paid for. The late 70s roared on, a golden age for American agriculture. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union was lifted, and they started buying American wheat and corn with a ferocious appetite. Prices shot through the roof. A bushel of corn, which had been a little over $1 when the decade started, was pushing $3.50. Soybeans were even better, Land that I'd seen sell for $500 an acre in the early 70s was now commanding prices of $2,000, then $3,000. It was a fever. Everywhere you looked, you saw the evidence of the boom. New pickups in every farmyard, new pole barns and machine sheds going up, their shiny tin roofs glinting in the sun. And the equipment was breathtaking. The dealerships couldn't keep the big tractors in stock. Four-wheel drives with air-conditioned cabs, stereo systems, and more horsepower than a freight train were the new kings of the field. Combines with grain heads 30 feet wide rolled across the landscape, devouring hundreds of acres in a single day. Rich Davies was at the forefront of it all. He bought the quarter section north of me for a price that made my head spin. Then he bought the 80 acres to the east. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now. His new grain setup was finished, a gleaming silver monument to prosperity that towered over the countryside. He traded in his IH 1586 for a brand new Steiger Panther III, a monster of a machine that made my old Bearcat look like a garden tractor. He was the talk of the coffee shop, the man everyone pointed to as a success. He was featured in the county newspaper, standing in front of his new combine with Mr. Abernathy from the bank, both of them grinning like Cheshire cats. The headline read, "The Future of Farming." Meanwhile, I kept on. The good prices were a blessing, no doubt about it. The year after the auction, 1979, was my most profitable year ever. But I didn't see it as a license to spend. I saw it as a chance to prepare. My father, who had farmed through the Great Depression, had taught me one thing above all else. The fat years are for storing up against the lean, and the lean years always come. So while Rich was buying land and iron, I was paying off the last of my farm's mortgage. I walked into Mr. Abernathy's bank on a Tuesday in October and handed him a check for the final payment. He wasn't happy. A paid-off loan doesn't make the bank any money. He tried one last time to get me to refinance, to unlock the equity and invest in growth. I politely declined, took my signed note, and walked out a free man. It was a feeling better than any new tractor. With the farm clear, I used the profits from the high grain prices to build a cash reserve. I put it in simple savings accounts and certificates of deposit. I also bought a few gold coins, something tangible. My wife, Sarah, thought I was being foolish. "Jed, the neighbors are putting in a swimming pool," she told me one night. "The Millers just got back from a vacation in Hawaii. Our kids are the only ones in their class who don't have a new 10-speed bike. People think we're poor." "We're not poor, Sarah," I said, looking out the kitchen window at my fields, dark and resting under the moon. "We're secure. There's a difference." "It doesn't feel different when you're the talk of the town," she said quietly. "They call you Scrap Iron Jed behind your back, you know. They say you're too afraid to take a chance." I knew they did. I heard the whispers at the elevator. I saw the looks at church. In a world gone mad with credit, the man who lived within his means was an outcast, a fool. My discipline was seen as cowardice. My caution was seen as a lack of vision. It was a lonely feeling. I was running a one-man race, sticking to old rules in a game where all the rules had been changed. The only place I found peace was in my shop or in the cab of the Steiger. That old tractor was my partner. Its big cat diesel settled into a deep, comforting roar when it was pulling hard. I knew every sound it made. I knew the specific whine of the hydraulics when the oil was cold. I knew the slight shudder it gave just before the turbo kicked in. I maintained it with a fanaticism born of necessity. I changed the oil every 100 hours, used the best filters, and kept the grease fittings full. When something broke, I fixed it myself, poring over the thick service manuals I'd bought, learning the machine's guts piece by piece. One afternoon in the late summer of 1980, I was turning wrenches on the Massey combine, getting it ready for the fall harvest. Rich Davies pulled into the yard, this time in a brand new silver Cadillac. He got out, leaving the engine running and the air conditioning blasting. "Jedediah," he called out, walking toward the machine shed. "Still tinkering with that old relic?" "Getting her ready," I said, not looking up from the cylinder bar I was adjusting. "You ought to just park it in the weeds and call the salvage man," he said with a laugh. "I just signed the papers on a new International 1480 axial flow. Thing's a beast. Cornhead and a bean platform. Cost more than your whole farm's worth, but it'll pay for itself in 2 seasons." He leaned against the doorframe, looking around my yard. "You know, Jed, I feel sorry for you. You've worked hard your whole life, and you've got nothing to show for it but a pile of old junk and a paid-for piece of dirt. You missed the boat. The party's almost over, and you never even had a drink." "I'm happy with what I've got, Rich," I said. "That's because you don't know what you could have," he shot back. "But that's not why I'm here. I want to buy your farm." I finally stopped what I was doing and looked at him. "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale for the right price, Jed," he said, that arrogant smirk back on his face. "I'll give you $4,000 an acre. Cash. You can take the money, move to town, buy a little house. Sarah would like that. No more worrying about breakdowns or the price of corn. You can retire. $4,000 an acre." It was an astronomical price, more than the land was truly worth. It was a tempting offer. It would mean a lifetime of security, an end to the whispers and the pitying looks. But it would also mean giving up the only thing that was truly mine, the land my grandfather had broken with a team of mules. "This land is my home, Rich. It's not just an asset on a balance sheet." The answer is no. He shook his head, his smirk turning into a sneer. "Suit yourself, old man. But when the bank owns everything from my fence row to the river, don't come asking me for a job. I'll be offering you 100 to 1 on that. I'm going to own this whole county." He turned and walked back to his Cadillac, the gravel crunching under his expensive boots. He was wrong. The bank didn't own his land. The bank owned him. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee long after Sarah had gone to bed. I turned on the old Zenith radio on the counter, keeping the volume low. I twisted the dial past the music stations, looking for the late-night news out of Des Moines. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking. "And sources inside the Federal Reserve say Chairman Paul Volcker is preparing for another, more aggressive hike in the federal funds rate to combat runaway inflation. Some economists are predicting interest rates could top 20% by next year." 20%. The number hung in the air of my quiet kitchen. I thought of Rich Davies and his new combine, his new grain bins, his hundreds of acres of newly acquired land, all of it financed. His loans weren't fixed-rate mortgages like my old one had been. They were operating loans, lines of credit, with variable interest rates tied to the prime. I looked out the window. A full moon cast a pale, ghostly light over my fields of corn, the tassels heavy and full. Across the road, the security lights on Rich's massive grain bins cast a sterile, artificial glare. He was sleeping the sound sleep of a man who believed he had conquered the world. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The party wasn't almost over. For men like Rich, it was already finished. They just hadn't heard the last song yet. The silence of my farm, the deep, profound quiet of a place that owed nothing to anyone, was suddenly the most valuable thing I owned. My old Steiger sat cold and dark in the machine shed, its engine silent, its steel fully paid for. It wasn't a relic, it was an ark. And I could hear the rain starting to fall. The first sign of trouble wasn't thunder, but a whisper from Moscow. In the winter of 1980, after the Soviets rolled their tanks into Afghanistan, President Carter slammed the door on grain sales. The endless appetite that had driven prices to the moon suddenly vanished. The numbers on the board at the co-op elevator began to slide, then tumble. $3 corn became $2.50, then $2.20. Men who had signed loan papers based on $3 corn started doing desperate math on the backs of envelopes, their faces tight with a new kind of fear. That spring, the sky turned against us too. The rains just stopped. April was dry. May was a dust bowl. The soil I'd turned with my repaired Oliver plow was as fine and grey as cremated bone. The young corn plants, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, were stunted and yellow, their leaves curled tight like cigars, trying to hold on to what little moisture they had. The heat was relentless. Day after day, the sun hung in a hazy white sky, baking the life out of the land. I watched Rich Davies from my fence row. He was running his equipment day and night, trying to beat the drought. He'd installed a massive center pivot irrigation system on the old Henderson place, a quarter-mile-long steel skeleton that crawled in a perfect circle, sucking water from a deep well. The diesel engine that ran the pump roared 24 hours a day, a constant, expensive drone that hung over the valley. It was a marvel of modern farming, but I knew what it cost to run. Every drop of water that sprayed from those nozzles was another drop of debt. My own corn was suffering, but I had planted it on my most resilient ground, the low-lying fields with rich black soil that held moisture like a sponge. It wasn't pretty, but it would make a crop. I conserved my fuel, parked my machinery, and waited. There was nothing else to do. My father used to say, "You can't fight the weather, you can only endure it." One blistering afternoon in July, I saw the dealership service truck pull into Rich's Lane. It sat there all day. The next morning, it was still there. I drove over on my old Alice Chalmers chore tractor, a bucket of tools rattling behind the seat. I found Rich standing beside his new Steiger Panther III, its massive hood tilted open. A young mechanic in a clean uniform was staring blankly at the engine. "What's the trouble?" I asked, climbing down. Rich barely looked at me. His face was pale under his tan, and his eyes were shot with red. "The transmission. It's the new power shift. Something with the electronic controller. He can't figure it out." I looked at the engine compartment. It was a maze of wires, hydraulic lines, and circuit boards. It looked more like the inside of a television set than a tractor. My Bearcats 3208 Cat was a simple beast of iron and steel. I could practically rebuild it with a crescent wrench and a hammer. This thing was a different species entirely. "They're gonna have to haul it to Des Moines," Rich said, his voice hollow. "Gonna be 2 weeks, maybe 3, and a new controller is $12,000. $12,000 for a part I couldn't even see. He still had 300 acres of beans to cultivate. He was burning diesel to pump water onto his corn and paying a mechanic $100 an hour to stand and scratch his head, all while his prize tractor sat dead in the field. The cracks in his empire were beginning to show, and they ran deeper than the fissures in the parched earth. Later that week, I saw him at the gas station in town. He was arguing with the owner, his voice sharp and loud. His account was past due. He finally paid with a check, his hand shaking as he signed it. He saw me watching, and his face hardened. He got in his Cadillac and peeled out of the lot, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of burning rubber. The golden boy was tarnished. The man who was going to own the county couldn't even pay his fuel bill on time. The drought broke in August, with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what little corn was left in the fields. The harvest of 1981 was a disaster. Prices were in the gutter, and yields were even lower. The only thing that was high was the interest rate. Paul Volcker had kept his promise. The prime rate, the number that banks used as a baseline, soared past 20%. Variable rate operating loans, the kind that 90% of farmers had, were suddenly ticking time bombs. A $100,000 loan that had cost $8,000 a year in interest now cost over $20,000. It was like trying to fill a swimming pool with a leaking bucket during a drought. It was impossible. The farm crisis had begun. It came on quietly at first, a few hushed rumors at the coffee shop about a neighbor being in trouble. Then the auction notices started appearing in the paper, small black and white ads that read like obituaries. They weren't retirement sales anymore, they were foreclosure auctions, ordered by the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank. Mr. Abernathy's bank. The mood of the county changed. The optimism of the 70s curdled into a bitter soup of fear and anger. The new pickups and fancy vacations were a distant memory. Now the talk was of survival. Men I'd known my whole life, strong, proud men, walked around with a haunted look in their eyes, the look of a captain on a sinking ship. They had followed the advice of the experts, the bankers, the magazines. They had gotten big. And now they were going broke. I kept my head down. I harvested my meager crop with the old Massey Ferguson. It broke down twice, once with a snapped feeder chain and once with a clogged sieve. Both times I had it running again in a few hours, using parts I had salvaged over the years. My fuel tanks were full, paid for with cash from my savings. My property taxes were paid. I had no loans, no payments, no one to answer to but myself and the good Lord. My family ate simply. We didn't have a swimming pool, but we had food on the table and a roof over our heads that was ours and ours alone. The whispers about scrap iron Jed had stopped. Now, when I walked into the elevator, the men would fall silent, watching me with a new expression. It wasn't pity anymore. It was a desperate, grasping kind of respect. They were looking at a survivor. The day of Richard Davies's auction was cold and grey. A miserable Saturday in November of 1982. The sky spit a cold, stinging rain. It felt appropriate. The whole county, it seemed, was there, parked up and down the gravel road for half a mile in either direction. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to watch a king be dethroned, to see the final, brutal consequence of the dream they had all been sold. I stood at the back of the crowd with Sarah. All of Rich's magnificent equipment was lined up in neat rows, washed and polished one last time. The Steiger Panther through, its transmission finally repaired. The International 1480 axial flow combine, its red paint looking as bright and hopeful as the day it was delivered. The fleet of tractors, the plows, the planters, the massive grain trucks, an entire kingdom of iron, all of it belonging to the bank. Mr. Abernathy was there, standing near the auctioneer's truck, his face like a stone mask. He wasn't the friendly booster anymore. He was the undertaker, here to bury a client. Rich was nowhere to be seen. His wife and kids had already moved to her parents' house in town. The farmhouse stood empty, a foreclosure notice tacked to the front door. The auctioneer started. The prices were heartbreaking. Equipment that had been bought for $250,000 just 2 years before was selling for 30 or 40 cents on the dollar. The market was flooded. Every farmer was broke. No one had money to buy. The only bidders were the implement dealers and the out-of-state vultures, picking the bones clean. I watched the Steiger Panther sell for $60,000. 2 years earlier, it had cost Rich over $200,000. The big axial flow combine went for even less. It was a slaughter. Sarah squeezed my hand, her knuckles white. "This is awful, Jed," she whispered. "It's the way the world works, Sarah," I said, my voice thick. "The bank always gets its money back." Then they came to the grain bins, the 2 massive 50,000 bushel bins and the new grain leg that had been Rich's pride and joy. The auctioneer started the bidding at $50,000. Silence. The rain dripped from the brims of the men's hats. No one had that kind of money. 40,000, boys. Who'll give me 40? Silence. 30,000. A brand new setup, folks, for 30,000. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward and had a quiet word with the auctioneer. The auctioneer nodded grimly. "All right, folks. The bank wants this moved today. We're selling it absolute, no reserve. What am I bid?" I thought of Rich's boast, of owning the whole county. I thought of my father's warnings about debt. I thought of the years of ridicule, of being called a fool and a coward. I looked at those gleaming silver monuments to hubris, and I raised my hand. 10,000, I said, my voice clear and steady. A gasp went through the crowd. Every head turned to look at me. Mr. Abernathy's eyes widened. He stared at me as if he'd never seen me before. "I have $10,000 from Jedstone," the auctioneer bellowed, a new energy in his voice. "Who'll give me 12.5? 12.5? Silence. The dealers weren't interested. They couldn't move something like that. The farmers couldn't afford it. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer looked straight at me, a flicker of a smile on his face. "Sold. For $10,000 to Jedediah Stone." I owned it. The symbol of everything I had stood against, the centerpiece of Rich's leveraged empire, was mine. And I had paid for it with cash from a coffee can I kept buried in the machine shed. The next morning was a Sunday. After church, there was a knock on our door. It was Richard Davies. He looked like a ghost. He was thin, his eyes were hollowed out, and he wore a cheap jacket that was too small for him. He stood on my porch, twisting his worn-out cap in his hands, not meeting my eyes. "Jed," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I heard you bought the bins." "I did," I said. He finally looked up, and I saw a man utterly broken. The arrogance, the smirk, the swagger, it was all gone, stripped away by the brutal arithmetic of the bank. They were good bins," he stammered. "Top of the line. You got a good deal." "I suppose I did," I said, waiting. He swallowed hard. "Look, Jed, I wanted to say, you were right. All this time you were right. I was a fool. I flew too close to the sun and I got burned. I lost everything. The farm, the house, everything. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I could have said, "I told you so." I could have slammed the door in his face. I could have savored the victory he had handed me. But looking at the shell of the man in front of me, I felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness for what had been lost. Not just his farm, but the farms of dozens of men like him, a whole generation of farmers wiped out by their own ambition and the false promises of easy credit. "The harvest is all in, Rich," I said quietly, "but I have to move all my corn from my old cribs over to those new bins before winter sets in for good. It's a big job. I could use an extra hand to run the augers and the grain trucks. I'll pay you a fair wage." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He didn't understand. He was expecting scorn, and I was offering him a job. He was expecting a lecture, and I was offering him a lifeline. You'd do that?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After everything?" "A man's got to work, Rich," I said, "and the corn needs to get in the bin. Can you start tomorrow morning?" He nodded, unable to speak, and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He turned and walked away, his shoulders a little less slumped than when he had arrived. Sarah came and stood beside me in the doorway, slipping her arm around my waist. "That was a good thing you did, Jedediah Stone," she said softly. "He's a farmer," I said, watching him walk down my lane. "He just forgot what that meant for a little while. Rich worked for me that winter and all through the next year. He was a good worker, quiet and humbled. He never talked about what he'd lost, but I could see the pain in his eyes every time he looked across the road at the farm that had once been his, now owned by an insurance company from Chicago and rented out to the highest bidder. The community slowly healed around us. The farm crisis left deep scars. We lost a lot of good families. The ones who survived were the ones like me, the ones who had been cautious, the ones who had been called fools. Scrap Iron Jed was now just Jed, a man whose advice was sought at the co-op, whose opinion was valued at the bank, which had a new president after Mr. Abernathy took an early retirement. In the spring of '84, the bank put the original Davies homestead up for sale. Not the new land he'd bought, but the 80 acres his father had farmed. They were asking a pittance for it. I went to Rich one afternoon while we were working on the planter. "The bank is selling your dad's old place," I said. "You should buy it back." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "With what, Jed? I don't have a pot to piss in." "I do," I said. I handed him a bank book. It was a savings account I had opened in his name, and I had been depositing his wages in it all year, along with a little extra. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough for a down payment. "I'll co-sign the loan." "Your name is mud at the bank, but mine's pretty good these days. Pay me back when you can." He looked at the bank book, then at me, his eyes shining with tears. This time he didn't try to hide them. "Why, Jed? Why are you doing all this for me?" I thought for a long moment, the smell of grease and old iron filling the air in my shop. "Because this county has lost enough good farmers," I said. "It doesn't need to lose another one." He took the book. He bought the farm. He started over, small and smart, with a couple of old tractors and a mountain of hard-won humility. Years passed. My son, David, grew up and decided he wanted to farm with me. He was a good boy, smart, with a knack for mechanics. I taught him everything I knew. I taught him how to weld a straight bead, how to time a diesel engine, how to listen to a machine and know what it needed. But the most important lessons weren't in the shop. They were at the kitchen table with the old account ledgers spread out before us. "Look here," I'd tell him, pointing to a column of figures. "This is your cost of production. This number is king. It doesn't matter if corn is $5 a bushel if it costs you $6 to grow it. And this," I'd say, tapping the line for debt service, which was always zero, "this is your freedom. Never ever give this up for a new coat of paint." One crisp fall afternoon, when I was well into my 60s, I was in the barn with my grandson, little Sammy. He was watching me work on the old John Deere 4020. I was adjusting the points in the distributor, a delicate task. "Grandpa," he asked, his small voice echoing in the cavernous barn, "why do we use these old tractors?" "Mr. Davies has a new one. It's got a computer in it." I smiled and wiped my hands on a rag. I pulled him up onto my lap on the tractor seat. "Sammy," I said, "there's nothing wrong with new, but there's a difference between something that's new and something that's yours. This tractor," I patted the green fender, "is ours. No banker can ever come take it away. We know every bolt on it. When it breaks, we can fix it. It asks for nothing but fuel and a little grease, and in return, it gives us everything. It's not just a machine. It's part of the family." I turned the key. The old diesel engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life, settling into the smooth, familiar rhythm I had known my entire life. The sound of solvency, the sound of survival. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the fields that my father and his father had worked. The land was still here. We were still here. Across the road, Rich Davies was working his small piece of ground, a silhouette against the dying light. He had survived too. We both had. I throttled the engine down to a low idle and looked out the barn door at the vast, quiet expanse of my farm. The air was cool and smelled of rich soil and harvested corn. In the machine shed, the old Steiger Bearcat sat silent, a great green beast at rest, its work done. It hadn't been the fanciest or the newest or the most powerful tractor in the county. But it had been enough, and it had been mine. In the end, that's all that mattered.